Nearly 1 in 4 women in the United States reports experiencing violence by a current or former spouse or boyfriend at some point in her life. That fact was provided on the website of the Futures Without Violence organization. Futures Without Violence is a nonprofit organization worth supporting because of its dedication to educating audiences and providing leadership in order to end domestic violence since 1980. Their main center is in San Francisco, California, but they do have a local office right here in Washington, D.C. Domestic violence is a significant issue that has serious repercussions on physical and mental health, and today I will persuade you to commit to ending domestic violence. While anyone can be a victim of domestic violence, women are the ones who are most at risk. I will be discussing how women and their children are affected by domestic violence, what the Futures Without Violence organization is doing to combat that issue, and how you yourself can get involved with the Futures Without Violence organization and help prevent domestic violence. I have researched various sources and compiled a list of facts to help me illustrate the significance of ending domestic violence and supporting the Futures Without Violence organization. So why is domestic violence such a serious issue? According to the Futures Without Violence website, women are much more likely than men to be victimized by a current or former intimate partner. Women are 84% of spouse abuse victims and 86% of victims of abuse at the hands of a boyfriend or girlfriend. About 3/4 of the persons who commit family violence are male. Preventing domestic violence benefits the physical and mental health of women and their children. But first, we're going to discuss how it affects women. Women are more susceptible to illness and disease when they are victims of domestic violence. Women who are victims of domestic violence are also more likely to abuse illicit substances. A document released by the Futures Without Violence organization states, a study released in 2010 that compared victims with never abused women found victims had approximately a 6-fold increase in clinically identified substance abuse. Next, we're going to discuss how children are affected by domestic violence. Children are much more likely to have a healthy psychological development when they are not exposed to domestic violence. Children who are not exposed to domestic violence are also less likely to experience maltreatment in their homes. On the other hand, children who are exposed to domestic violence often exhibit violent tendencies when they grow older. Those children often might experience difficulties with their cognitive ability as well. The scholarly journal Clinical Child and Family Psychology Review featured a paper written by Joy Osofsky. In it, she writes, for children exposed to violence, aggressive behaviors are common, as are reduced social competencies, depression, fears, anxiety, sleep disturbances, and learning problems. She also writes, on the basis of available research, there is little doubt that vast numbers of children are exposed to domestic violence and that children's responses may vary widely depending on their risk and vulnerability, as well as the structure of their environments. So where does Futures Without Violence come in? The Futures organization has partnered with the Department of Health and Human Services, as well as the Department of Justice to fund programs that provide community outreach and support to end domestic violence. Futures Without Violence provides a wide variety of information and resources for different demographics on the subject of domestic violence. They offer programs for men, women, and children. They have started initiatives for ending childhood trauma and ensuring healthy development. They offer workshops for men who use violence and hold events with influential male figures who are advocates for ending domestic violence to provide boys with positive role models. The Futures organization also brings awareness to human trafficking and aims to educate everyone about workplace safety. They work tirelessly and passionately with grassroots movements to get Congress to pass the Violence Against Women Act. According to an article in the Congressional Digest magazine, since the passing of the legislation of the Violence Against Women Act, society has seen an improved criminal justice response. The government has allocated funding for shelters and support services for victims, and many states have reformed their laws to take a more strict approach with regards to domestic violence. Next, we're going to talk about how you can get involved with Futures Without Violence and prevent domestic violence. Futures Without Violence offers a number of different ways that you can become involved with their programs. You can, of course, donate and explore or share their resources, but the best way to become involved is to be what they call a change maker. Their change makers vary by demographic and include teenagers who can help educate their peers about digital dating abuse by becoming a That's Not Cool ambassador. Coaches can become involved. They can educate their athletes about the importance of respect and nonviolence. College students can also become involved and educate themselves and others about the prevalence of sexual assault on campus. The best way to end domestic violence is to prevent it from occurring at all. Domestic violence can be prevented by teaching healthy relationship skills. Preventing domestic violence can be achieved by engaging influential adults and peers and disrupting developmental pathways that lead to violence. That is essential to preventing domestic violence. The National Coalition Against Domestic Violence references a public CDC document that states, supporting the development of healthy, respectful, and nonviolent relationships has the potential to reduce the occurrence of intimate partner violence and prevent its harmful and long-lasting effects on individuals, families, and the communities where they live. So in conclusion, domestic violence is a prevalent issue that affects women more than any other demographic. I discussed why it is important to end domestic violence, how the Futures Without Violence organization is involved in the fight against domestic violence, and how you can get involved with the Futures Without Violence organization and help prevent it from occurring. The best way to end domestic violence is to take steps to prevent it. Supporting information from reputable sources showed that women and children are more likely to be healthier and more productive when domestic violence is removed from their environment. Legislation such as the Violence Against Women Act have offered support and funding for victims of domestic violence, and this legislation was pushed forward by organizations such as Futures Without Violence. I encourage you all to commit to ending domestic violence and promote healthy relationships, and support the organization Futures Without Violence. In Paula Nicholson's book, Domestic Violence and Psychology, A Critical Perspective, she urges that to neglect the emotions, experiences, and psychological explanations for domestic violence is to fail those who suffer and thwart attempts to prevent future abuse.